Hey, everybody, this is Tech in Motion Podcast. Welcome to the next episode. Today, we have a really exciting guest, Mike Beck. The point of this, and I was kind of talking to you a bit on the way here, is to simulate for people in two different kind of personas in the audience. One, people who are at different stages in their career that are curious about how you got where you are and what your thoughts are around your career progression. And then also, we have leadership members in the audience who are interested in understanding what your perspective as a leader is on various topics. So from a history perspective, because we want to get to know who you are in this role in tech, I understand you've been in tech for like over 20 years now.
I have, yeah. It's a long time.
That's a considerable amount of time. You look pretty young for that, so that's great.
I'll take that.
There you go.
Thank you.
But you started in software engineering. You started with a CS degree, software engineer, and then you went from that and you hit on, government intelligence, got into cybersecurity, got into dark trace, and now CISO. A lot, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So if you could kind of frame that a little bit, starting from your first entry into tech, how do you feel like you got where you are?
Yeah, sure. So I think my first entry into tech is when I'm in the UK we call them A levels, but I guess it's your kind of end of high school. You're thinking about university, and it was like the .com bubble for me. So I was like, this sounds great. I need to get into this. I'm like, what do I need to do? So I'm looking through kind of prospectuses and looking at different courses, and I get into a computer science course in Plymouth on the south coast in England, and get there, and the .com bubble bursts. Can you believe it? And look, I still kind of got my first taste of technology. I remember really kind of vividly that first year I really struggled with, like, is this for me? I'm not very good at it. And then kind of something kind of clicked, I think, in my second year where I was like, yeah, I really liked the creativity of software engineering. Something clicked in my brain about how to kind of piece it together and how it worked, and it was like, it was a huge moment for me because I kind of realized that I can kind of do this, and I can figure stuff out. And that kind of led on to post-university, looking for different jobs, and I ended up in the government doing software engineering, and that was fantastic. I got to learn the kind of waterfall method of software engineering. It's very slow. I guess I was very, you come in as a new grad and you're kind of like, you got loads of energy and you want to do stuff. And, I remember like my first bug fix that I was gonna work on. I was like, I can do this. I can do this like really quickly. And then like my mentor was like, whoa, this needs to be done server side. And there's all these like tests that you've got to write. And, it's a very, methodical process. So I was like, okay, yeah, that was really interesting, that kind of environment. And I did that for a couple of years, and I really got to, I was doing kind of Java, Oracle development, and scripting, and, I was enjoying it. But I remember my line manager at the time kind of sitting me down one day and just sort of saying, look, you're good at your job. I don't want to say you're not good at your job, but you don't seem to love it. And I was like, he's right. Like, I don't kind of go home in the evening and live and breathe it. I kind of went off and did different things, and I came back to my day job. And that was a kind of, it was a great moment, for somebody to sit me down and say, and sort of talk to me a little bit more about what a future might look like. Is this if this is the career you're in, then great, but explore other avenues. And I was very lucky, obviously, being inside kind of UK government structures at that point already. So you can kind of look for jobs in and around what you're already in. And I managed to kind of find an opportunity to pivot. And I ended up working for the kind of UK Defence Department and did a number of tours out to Afghanistan. And
Wow.
that was, that was fascinating. It was a huge kind of change, huge career shift, nothing to do with software engineering, but got to learn a lot about the military, about operations in the field, different cultures. I got to learn, I ended up, learning Dari when I was working in Kabul. Fascinating kind of experience. And then, kind of came back from I did that kind of on and off for around 4 years. I came back and I guess I was like, what next? Like, what's, where do I head next from this? And the opportunity kind of presented itself to this kind of new and emerging area of cybersecurity. And I kind of thought, well, that kind of marries up my technology skills. I have, had some rusty technology skills. I had this kind of idea of being operational and doing something that kind of mattered, and it kind of glued that really nicely together. And I ended up working in kind of analysis for UK government in terms of how cyber actors were trying to compromise UK systems. I got to learn an awful lot about how that activity was taking shape and the tactics being used and how those groups would operate. And that was really, I found that really fascinating. And that really led me into, a couple of years working at the tactical level, kind of really piecing together analysis that kind of help illuminate how some of those nation state actors were working. So it was a great kind of, overview. And then I guess to finish up on that kind of final step, this Dark Trace had kind of just been formed at the time, and I knew somebody who had gone there and was one of the founding team, and I thought they were a good guy, and I was like, I'll take a punt and I'll go and see what they're doing. And I guess there was an element of frustration at the time around how we were able to stop cyber attacks, and that was really hard back in the day where you were working on things. I think a lot's changed now today. You have like CISO and NCSC in the UK. You have these government bodies who are really doing an awful lot at a government level to stop cyber attack, and I think that's incredibly good work. But back when I was there, that was very much kind of just emerging. So for me to go to Dark Trace, this new kind of technique, so to use machine learning to illuminate the threat rather than to use known tactics and procedures, was just a really interesting concept. I didn't know if it was going to work. I didn't know if it was going to be something, but I thought I'd take a punt, and here I am 11 years down the line.
Wow. It's a wealth of experience.
Yeah.
It's funny. You said, what employee number were you?
I think something like number 8. There were already kind of technology. There were already software engineers in place who were kind of working on different projects. But in terms of specifically Dark Trace employees, it was around something like that. Number 8.
That's amazing. You said a lot, and I have some questions. So starting at the beginning, you said a couple really interesting things. For the audience members that are newer in their careers, it sounded like you started studying CS, was having a bit of a hard time with it for some time. You think you said about a year. And then something started to click. In that time period for you, when you were at the beginning, what made you kind of push through that rough patch? Because I know a lot of people that are in that right now, and trying to figure out, is this something I should push through or not?
Gosh, great question. I think if I was being brutally honest about me, I'd probably jumped into something because I thought it was dollar. I thought it just equaled dollar signs, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, sounds great, and I want to die.
That's honest.
And then and then I got there, and I was like, oh, this is a bit. It's something kind of pretty new to me that I didn't really kind of, I definitely hadn't grown up in a household that had access to computers or anything like that. So I didn't have any, I wasn't bringing any capability to that course at all. I was literally like there, sort of rabbit in headlights, trying to figure it out. I guess what propelled me kind of through that, I think, not wanting to fail. I could have, I definitely could have walked away, and I definitely thought about it a number of times, like maybe just change course, right, and do something different. But I didn't, I didn't want to. I wanted to kind of continue with it, and it's a really, it's so sort of vivid in my mind. It was a holiday period, and I was back home from college, and there had been coursework set for that holiday period to build a hotel check-in application. I was really struggling with it, I was really struggling to the point where I was like trying to copy code snippets and glue it together, and I didn't, and I just remember sort of one day being like, I'm gonna work this out, and this was, I can't remember the date, but the internet was sort of very early, right? I was working from a book, with all the kind of classes in and the different calls you could make. And I just remember kind of really working through it for a couple of days. And in that process, I just had some sort of eureka moment where I figured out how to make a function call and how to, declare variables and how to move them around. And it was like, oh, it's like, this is how it kind of pieces together. And for all the teaching that was happening, I couldn't map onto that. But when I kind of sat down and went through it, I had some sort of eureka moment. And it was great. And it's an experience I remember to this day that, it kind of clicked for me.
So there's a reason why you decided and said, I don't want to fail. I don't want to quit. That led to the eureka moment. And you said that it was this internal desire to not fail. I'm not going to let you off the hook with that, because why? Why didn't you want to fail? The reason why I'm touching on it again is because there's a lot of times in life where you go down a track, it doesn't work for you, you figure out this isn't for me, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But there's something either innate in you or from the people in your life or whatever your experience is that says, no, I'm doubling down on this. What was that for you?
Gosh, you're absolutely right. And I would definitely, I fully agree with you. Mistakes are an important part of our learning journey, right? It's absolutely fine to go down an avenue and realize that's not the avenue, and to come back out of that. I think for me, certainly, I was the first person to go to college in my family. I was just, it was just me and my mum. So, I think, she'd sacrificed an awful lot to get me to that point. So I didn't want to, probably, not wanting to let her down. And, that kind of probably propelled me through that period, just wanting to kind of, make sure I came out of it, and her efforts to get me to there, weren't in vain. And I think that was probably my driving factor back then.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That's how it felt like something. It's always something like that, right? Whereas it's a deeply personal thing. For me, it was very similar, and it was a need to be able to provide and build on top of the life that was given to me, and try to make something better for the people that I loved. that got me through those very difficult moments where I wanted to quit.
Mm.
And hearing that from someone like you, who is in the position that you are and have done the work that you've done for so long, it humanizes the experience again.
Mm.
Because something that I'm afraid of for the younger audience is they see someone like you, they see what you've accomplished, and they view it as so far-fetched from where they are. But that one little detail right there makes you like, no, this is something that's reachable. So I love and I appreciate that you were willing to share that. Because for me, it was a money thing too. I'm gonna keep
Yeah.
like, you have moms
Yeah.
holding it down,
Yeah.
and you're like, this life can't be like this anymore. I have to do something. And you did that thing. So then fast forward, we're in intelligence, we're doing some amazing things. I don't want this podcast to get erased for some suspicious reason, so we're not going to talk about all of that. But you fast forward and you've developed a different type of experience. This is the piece I do want to talk about that, because you started as a software engineer. You then were like, I don't know if I love this. The money is definitely there and has helped. But it sounded like you were like, I don't know if I love it. I'm not passionate about it. I'm not bringing it home. For me, it was different. I did find out I love it just by happenstance. I did start bringing it home. But for you, you didn't, and you pivoted. So now someone in their career for 1 to 3 years who's like, oh man, what do? I don't know if I love this. And yet you're an illustration that we see time and time again of how you can maybe pivot. So at that transition point for you, when you said, man, my boss is right, you had a good manager, sound like that's great. I don't really love this. What were some things you were thinking in your mind? Was there any strategy around how do I take my skill sets, still capitalize on them, fulfill my responsibilities that I have in my own core values, but nourish that internal part of me and that love and passion for the work?
I would love to say that I had a strategy. I didn't.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
I just I guess I just started looking around and kind of, seeing what opportunities were there, what other jobs were available. And I feel, for me personally, the whole thing's been a zigzag to get to where I am. And I never thought I'd be a CISO. I never had that in my career plan. I still question, kind of every day, am I a good CISO? Am I getting better? How do I get, that definitely kind of, sits with me. I think back then, that pivot was gut instinct, and was very much just looking for something that excited me and, that I could get behind. And I think I had I definitely had the conscious thought that if I stayed in software engineering, I'll make more money, right? Definitely. I'd got to a point where the next move was probably go into private industry and, and kind of make that leap and continue to kind of develop my career that way. Definitely would have made more money. But I think there was just something in me that thought at this moment in time, I didn't have kids or anything then. I had freedom to move in terms of location wise and those sorts of things. And I thought, I'm just going to try something new. And, but yeah, no real strategy, just taking opportunities as they came.
See, I love that. And I talked to a decent amount of leaders, and that's why we're working to capture more of these, because this is a pattern that I've noticed. There's a point in time where, because you've done a certain amount of work, you now have the ability to trust your instincts. And that piece there is not articulated well in a lot of things I see online that are giving people career advice. There's a certain period of time where a pattern is you have to put in this work. You have to train your own self to be valuable to whatever market you're working in. Then you have the luxury and I think the responsibility to trust your instincts to lead you to the next level. Because I see when people don't do what you just expressed, they end up in a rut in their career and trying to figure out how to navigate and get out of that rut. So you say, and I love your answer in the transparency there, that there was no strategy. But I think more so there is a strategy. It's just not conscious the way people think about it, because you built experience, you got through the difficulty, and then you trusted yourself enough to invest in a new opportunity.
Yeah.
That's powerful in and of itself. And I want people to trust, to know that if you get into a field, if you start learning to code and you're like, I hate this, but you push past it, and then you get into a job where you're doing something code related, software related, whatever your niche is that you're choosing, for 1 to 3 years, there's nothing that keeps you stuck in that. You're really just buying a ticket into the ability to then understand the market you're in better and choose the path that really appeals to your interests. And you did that. That's an example. I don't know if you see something similar.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I really agree that, certainly in the early parts of your career, there's no bad move. It's experience. It's all experience building. And in my job today as CISO, when I'm thinking about kind of DevSecOps processes that I'm looking to kind of, mature, evaluate, report on, I bleed back to my experience as a software engineer. As a software engineer, what was I doing? I was writing code, I was checking it in, I was building unit tests. I have that knowledge of how software engineers operate. Maybe, it's out of date. I couldn't go back to it. The skills are too rusty. But that experience, that period that I worked in, I use in my current role, and it's so as you sort of said, that kind of I think you call them tickets almost. In different areas, you build those up, and it amounts to a level of experience that you can draw upon that gives you confidence that you're making the right decisions.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Your quote, actually, the other interview we did with Kelsey, he calls them lottery tickets.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, don't do the lottery. We're not encouraging gambling, but this is what he calls them, right? He says you put this work in, and you don't know what's going to pan out exactly. And that's the scary part. I was talking to a small group of folks early on in their career. Same thing. They're asking me questions like, well, how do I know that this will work or that will work? The difficult thing is, in the beginning, you just don't. But the thing that you know is that you're investing in your own learning. Now, that isn't to confuse you're working for an employer that's taking advantage of you and making you do work that you're not fairly compensated for. That's besides the point. An employer should require a similar amount of hours from you. But that extra time you put in, that self-investment, that's the thing where it's accompanied with some uncertainty. I don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. But now when time meets opportunity, I'm prepared. When Mike comes into the office and he's from overseas, but he's randomly in the office, now I have potentially something of value to give, right? And you didn't before. And if you had that mindset, which I think is a very scarcity-based mindset of, well, I'm not going to do any more than what my job requires of me, which isn't bad in and of itself, but if you desire career progression, it is the anti-pattern for that. You have to use those lottery tickets. You have to have this sort of almost act of faith in a way and invest in yourself with those things. What do you see that with people that are even under you that you lead? Like, is that something you notice as a leader?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. You can really notice the people who have put themselves out there to, again, I don't want to say they should be doing this as extra as part of their job, right? That's not the job should be specified, as you say, and you get paid for the job that you do. But the advice I give to lots of people I'm talking to and mentoring, like within our organization, is, make sure that you are working on top of cloud technologies, right? Because when you're a leader in 10, 20 years time, you would have been in the trenches. You know what it's like to build an account, put security settings around it, to put a workload on top and manage that. go through that process. Like, it costs peanuts to kind of, do that for yourself and figure that stuff out. But that is the experience that you'll draw upon, further down the line. And, for me, it was, a whole range of different things and taking opportunities that I guess, going back to, there wasn't a strategy, but my gut instinct told me none of this was a bad move, right? I didn't feel like, I never thought to myself that I wasn't getting in return from the job experience. I think when you get to a point where you're in a job and you're not feeling the return in terms of either money or learning opportunity or, operational experience, you got to be getting something else back from that job. I never kind of thought I got to those points, and I always got to play around. Now, I think age plays into this, as you get older, where I am today, and I have children, and I have priorities at home. Making sure I'm around, making sure that I bring my children up, making sure I provide for them. All those kinds of things build into something where actually, do I want to go and chase something different that's going to take me, that's going to affect that core of who I am and what I want? The pool of options gets smaller now as I get older. So I think there's a golden period where you're earlier in your career, where, if we use that ticket analogy again, you can pick up those tickets in different areas, and they're so valuable later on in that career, that you won't realize it at the time. It's not going to equate to, a financial, pay rise or a bonus or something at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But wow, you can really, you build those up, and you start to get into kind of interview processes for leadership. You're drawing upon a wealth of experience, and it's very much, when you're in the interview process for leadership roles, it's conversational. It's not sort of, talk to me how you did this job or this. It's very much conversational about your broad experience. I'm a big fan of broad experience, because I think it, there's something very much to be said for somebody who's seen different types of technology, who's been in different situations, and that can use that to kind of story tell around it. It's very powerful.
Right. You're really talking that talk right now, Mike. I think you're preaching right now, and I love it. The next part in your career, and you highlighted a little bit, so I think it's a great segue, is there's this portion after you trusted yourself, trusted your own experience, your intuition, and then you went from an individual contributor type of role at some point to a leadership type of role at some point. I don't know if CISO was the first time that happened, but I would love for you to highlight that decision-making process, because for me, I'm still in that very much so more individual contributor and mentorship at the team level, but you became an actual people leader. What was the decision-making process for you from, I'm going to focus on my skill set being an individual contributor, to I'm going to be a leader of people?
I'm not sure if you're going to like this answer. It's very much accidental again.
I love that answer.
Nothing in my career has been sort of, kind of directed by me. I guess after joining Darktrace, Darktrace was a startup, an absolute pure startup. When I first went there, no customers at all. We were figuring out kind of everything on the fly. And 11 years down the line, we're 9,000 customers and huge operation globally. But back in the early days, I think I brought forward that experience that I had, that I'd taken from different job roles and different places I'd been. And I think I do I do think that there's something there that I I'm a I think I'm a good manager, and I think I always had that in me. I'm a people person. I want to see the best in people. I want to talk to people honestly, and I want to encourage others. And so I think that was always in my kind of makeup as a person. Now, when we were in the thick of it, kind of, and we start to kind of build out an operation in Darktrace, and we go through the years and we move from kind of a startup to a young company to a company that's going places, and we start to kind of add people in. I think I was a natural fit, and I took over the sort of running of the cyber analyst team in Darktrace. So I built out a group of analysts who were working across our commercial portfolio with our customers. They were also supplying research into the R&D team. And it was very much a natural kind of progression move for me. Mm. And then the move to CISO on top of that was, again, my CEO called me up and was like, "You're going to be the CISO." And I was like, okay, right. Yep. So I've been very lucky with, and I was very lucky that she saw in me a person that could make that jump. It's, very hard making your first jump into a CISO role. I definitely was blindsided by the breadth of the role. Bear in mind, I was somebody who was kind of talking to customers, talking about how to do security with CISOs. I thought I'd be great at it, and I went in and I was like, whoa, this is broad. Mm-hmm. I was very good at the analysis side, the kind of the tech, the setting up the technology to run a security operation. I really enjoyed that. I was strong at it. I've been doing it for a long time. The compliance side, the regulatory side, running, for us, we're ISO 27001. That was completely kind of new to me. Although I kind of knew and understood some of this stuff, when I started to get into the detail of it, brand new. And you're learning, and you're learning fast. Mm. So it was a real eye opener. The breadth of that kind of introduction to a C-suite kind of role, engaging with the management team, being brought to the board, talking about cybersecurity upwards and delivering kind of cybersecurity downwards, was a huge learning curve for me.
Mm. That's amazing. It's another pattern that I notice with leaders such as yourself. A lot of the best leaders, I do know some exceptions, but a lot of the best leaders that I know didn't seek leadership. They just sought out, how can I be great at my craft? And then how can I help other people become great? Mm. And it started with them as some type of senior, helping this person. Management at the time notices them. And like you said, it becomes this natural thing. And I almost think, and this has been my experience, if you have to actively avoid leadership if you don't want to be a part of it. If you're genuinely interested in people and their progression. But for me, it's the administrative side that I don't love. But I think it's too a little bit of the age thing as well, because I just turned 30. And I find that it ends up being a lot of the time where you're most useful, right? You have to ask, like, where am I most useful in my org? A lot of that is still an individual contributor role, your technical skills, what you provide, but then you start mentoring more, you start helping more people, and it just becomes very difficult to avoid. It's been very difficult to avoid. I'll tell you that. But I love leaders like you. And if I ever was to get in that kind of people leadership type of role, that is the type of approach that I would want to take. I think you mentioned some technology stuff, and I think it's probably a good time to get into some of those things, because I'm very curious. So the next part here is going to be kind of tailing to the leadership, people that are in similar roles as you, people maybe a little bit at a later stage in their career, people that are just curious about how CISOs approach and think about certain technologies, how they maybe grade themselves, how you think about what is good for you and for your organization, some of those things. To start that, as a CISO, how would you define your core value and what your role is to the business?
I think my core role to the business is to make sure that Darktrace can operate in the way that it wants to operate. How can I help manage cybersecurity risk in our business to make sure we can achieve our business goals? How do I do it safely? How do I build a team out that has the specialist skills? I definitely put my hand up and say, cybersecurity is a team sport. There isn't one person that knows everything about cybersecurity. Far from it. So building out a team that you can trust and rely on to help execute that vision. And one of the biggest parts of being a CISO is being able to talk the business language and presenting how you're managing that risk upwards, and being able to have a conversation with the management team, with the audit and risk committee, with the board. That is certainly, something that is a key part to the job. It's something that's very hard to learn, very hard to get experience of. I personally have been learning on the job. Mentoring is huge, so I definitely have a great mentor who sits on our board, and she's been fantastic. She's a CISO previously, and for me, I get to kind of ask her questions. I get to show her how I might present things, and she gives me that kind of senior take on how that will be viewed, and that's been a huge part of my ability to sort of learn and navigate that pathway to coming up a level, right? Like to coming up to a leadership level and not just being a manager. Mentoring is very, very important in that process, because it's a very hard thing, I think, to simply learn.
That's really powerful. You said a lot of good things. One of the things that I loved was the emphasis in talking about your mentor, because I feel like people forget that sometimes. Like, you get into the C-suite and they're like, oh, they made it.
Yeah.
But I tell people all the time, no matter where you are in your career, you need an effective mentor. And even you and you telling us that you have one and that you're still learning and you're still growing, again, helps to just humanize the experience, right? I think that's really, really good. If you're thinking about, because as a CISO, right, but my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, a big part of your job, you mentioned the risk and audit committee, is justifying our security strategy to them, which also encompasses evaluating specific tooling that we use in order to make sure everything keeps flowing properly. For you as a CISO who has to evaluate tooling, decide if we're going to invest in particular things, how do you grade a technology that then you are going to use to justify to the risk and audit committee?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, it's doing lots of research, going to conferences, seeing what technology's out there, trying to get your head around the kind of broad landscape is really important. Moves so fast, especially in cybersecurity. That's kind of one of the it's a double-edged sword. Is one of the great things is that there's always kind of new ideas, new ways of doing things, new kind of concepts being brought to market. But the other side is that as somebody in charge of the security program, keeping up to date with that is a struggle sometimes. But you have to do it. You have to put that kind of time and energy into, it's one of the components of my job is definitely making sure I understand that landscape. I think having a strategy that you are executing against gives you a defensible program, right? Making sure that you're communicating what it is you're trying to do to secure the business. And there's going to be technology elements inside that strategy, but it's pointing you in the right direction of what you need to go and look at.
And just to be clear on defensible, I've heard this term. We've obviously talked. I've heard this term, but just so the audience understands in this context, if something bad happens, they're looking at you. Like there's a lot of people are scared of the CISO role. Let's just be honest about it. But if something bad happens, they're looking at you. And by defensible, you're saying that I need to be able to look at my entire security posture, what tooling we're using, how things are structured, so that when I go to the board, I go to the risk and audit committee, and they ask, what the heck happened? Mike, you're able to defend and say, no, we did check off the things that were important to make sure that we were in a good spot as a company. Is that what you mean?
100%. That's what I mean by defensible. I'm, exactly what you just said. It's the way that you can, you don't just take the money that the your CFO's given you and fingers crossed that you're going to put it in the right, into the right areas and into the right technology pots. It's making sure that you have a strategy that you're executing against, that you can demonstrate the defenses that you've built, the risks that you're covering, and you keep that conversation flowing up and back again. As the threat landscape changes, which it inevitably will, as the regulatory landscape changes, which it absolutely will, you're constantly updating that, and you're constantly having to show that what you are building in that cybersecurity function is defensible when an outside party comes to look. When you go through a cyber attack, which is inevitable, it's inevitable. Everybody is going to go through a cyber attack. Unless your business is offline and completely, locked down, you're going to go through it. And then when you do go through it, it's all about how can you present how you've spent the money in the program, the things that you've done to get to a point that you believe you're defending, given the budget that you're given, you're defending in the most sensible and appropriate way, and that you've had conversations upwards to get checks and balances and there's governance around the decisions that you've been making. And you get to a point where you can go through a cyber attack and your program is defensible. You've done all the right things given the budget level that's been set and the risk tolerance that the business believes it was able to cover given the money available. And you're in a place where you can say you've done all the right things. And that's a defensible cybersecurity program.
That makes sense to me. So that makes sense to me from the perspective of what am I really trying to accomplish at a high level? What's my responsibility to the business as a CISO? I'm very curious too, once you get into the job, how you actually measure a couple of those types of things. So for you, if you had to name the top 3 kind of measures that you like to use to say, hey, are we moving in the right direction? What would you say?
There's definitely more than 3 that I like.
As many as you want.
But certainly there's areas particularly around incidents that are occurring in your organization. So being able to measure the time that it takes from an incident, us becoming aware of an incident to the time that we're able to contain that and the time that then we're able to recover from that incident. Those are interesting numbers, so that we know that the money we're putting into a security operation function, the money we're putting into that is able to deal with the incidents that are coming through, and then we're able to recover and contain in a sensible time frame. Um, Certainly things like vulnerability exposure. So how long are systems remaining vulnerable before you get to be able to patch them? These are all, if I think about the metrics that really drive home a business, a lot of them are around the general hygiene inside your sort of cybersecurity program. There are a whole bunch of general hygiene points that if you get those right, you can actually, a lot of it is process and people before you even get to technology. But certainly when you set up a defensible program, you're going to want a whole bunch of those metrics across the business to be able to demonstrate again, how those how the people, process, and technology mix that you've set up is performing. And then, of course, industry benchmarks. If you can take some of those metrics, showcase them against industry benchmarks, then you're even in a more defensible place because you're able to say, here's what the industry standards are against some of these metrics that we're reporting against.
That makes a lot of sense. I have to ask this question out of very much so personal curiosity, because my background is also software engineering. I was raised in the cloud. My first initial infrastructure experience was through the cloud, and then I had to learn on-prem. So I kind of went a weird direction, right? But being in on-prem for a while now and having to navigate both environments, I noticed some very interesting things. And as a CISO who kind of has to think about both, what is something that you observe? I don't want to lead the witness. What is something that you observe in the difference as to how we handle on-premise and the kind of like more real-time-ish threat detection and response versus how we think about cloud security?
The two are very different and they're very same. It's a fascinating kind of place to be as a CISO. I grew up on-prem systems, right? That was my bread and butter. So I've had to learn about cloud operations and how to secure them, and that's something that again, I go back to my first earlier point. Learning and being in the trenches on a technology, you bring that all forward into your experience plane. I think the on-prem side is a really well understood area now and well trodden ground. I think on-prem is very much about getting to grips with just what you've got out there, and it's quite hard on on-prem infrastructures to even figure out what is connected to what. I obviously get to see a lot of different customer environments, and certainly when you look at businesses that have a mixture of kind of business IT and operational technology as well, that can be a CISO's nightmare in terms of thinking that you're completely air gapped and then all of a sudden realizing there's multiple connections that bridge these. So I think on-prem is very much about getting your head around what you've got and being able to maintain an inventory and really securing what you're presented with. I think cloud is clearly the kind of future, and the vast majority of people I see today are in that hybrid situation. They're still managing on-prem, but they've got larger kind of cloud footprints. And so for us in the cloud, it's very much about understanding configurations, understanding permissions, understanding structure and process of how DevOps are then touching those clouds. And so that's a very different type of security in a kind of day-to-day operation. And I think that kind of emergence of what we call it, I guess, as an industry, the DevSecOps community, those people who've grown up on cloud, who understand the deployment to cloud, they understand how to build templates, to build security templates on top of some of the infrastructure that that you have becomes a really important part of the security function. And when you start to blend kind of the more traditional security components with that DevSecOps styled security, and you start to get kind of an operation that is talking to one another and is able to build out policy process on top of that, you get to a really kind of strong place. But the I guess the anti-pattern to that is kind of like putting your head down a little bit and saying, well, look, I've got a cloud tool over here and I've got an on-prem tool over here, and thumbs up, we're doing security. Doing cloud security certainly is a lot more around process, around how the business is operating on top of that cloud infrastructure, for sure.
It's interesting. I appreciate that answer. I'm curious, because this is my observation. I did a post on this, I think, the other day, where cloud, the maturity, because I agree with you completely. On-premise just had a lot more time to mature, but it's also leaned a lot more into the manual processes of things and doing things. There's a lot more automation than there has been in the past, for sure. The extreme is cloud and how it automates everything. And the tooling that we have on-prem seems to have a difficult time at times matching up with the speed at which cloud does everything. Identity, infrastructure, all of it. And the thing that I'm seeing is in cloud, because of the sheer speed and volume of provisioning infrastructure and handling all these things, is that we've only really started to scratch the surface on cloud security from a preventative mindset. If you're getting alerts, it's because something's misconfigured. Oh, my bucket's public. Like, oh, this piece of infrastructure is misconfigured. That's really more so preventative security than it is like almost the equivalent of vulnerability management type of deal, like you were talking about. What do I have in my environment? And does it need to be patched? Are there misconfigurations? Things like that. What I'm really curious about is, are you thinking about, or other CISOs thinking about, what the next step in cloud is in order to keep up with the automation pace of cloud, but add in this detect type of capability, not just from misconfiguration, but actual live threats that are happening in an active real-time response? Because I don't even think we're scratching the surface on that yet in cloud. And I'm curious to your thoughts.
I fully agree with you, and I think we're gonna see a huge kind of continuation of this kind of cloud security journey into the next few years as we get more cloud natives kind of enter the workforce and enter the kind of the leadership roles as well in security. I think I'd almost view cloud security as sort of on-prem security 10 years ago, where it was very much, as you just mentioned, sort of a checklist of configurations and making sure they're correct. And, it wasn't, this kind of super dynamic world where at runtime in that cloud, you're able to kind of pick up on certain things that are happening that don't quite make sense. You and I obviously both work in a world where we're utilizing AI to do that in near real time and to piece that together. But it's not a solved problem. I think it's going to be fascinating over the next few years where that heads. I think the cloud providers themselves have a responsibility there to make sure they are being clear about the shared security model, but they're also making available the data points that are going to be required to do that type of security. But there's going to be so much kind of development over the next few years, I think, in getting cloud security to a place where the on-prem is today, for sure.
So you brought up AI. I didn't bring up AI. I just want you to know. So we're going to talk about AI. I want to make sure we're good on time, but I specifically want to talk about AI because I came to Darktrace. Honestly, I'm just going to be very candid. I didn't know if I believed in Darktrace when I was evaluating coming to Darktrace. And the more that I jumped in and the more that I jumped into the research, I generally speaking like our approach to AI. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is everyone says AI, but it means a lot of different things depending upon the context we're talking about. Generative AI has made AI commonplace. ChatGPT has made AI a common household name at this point. But this has been around, we know, for a very long time. Machine learning has been around for a very long time. When you talk about the effectiveness of AI in the security space, what do you think people should be thinking about when they're thinking, hey, should I bring AI into my environment? If so, what sort of AI, and what's important to me as a CISO when I'm evaluating that?
Big subjects. I think the first thing I'd say is you're right. AI has been around for an awful long time, but it has been made very popular recently, obviously through ChatGPT and such forth. I can remember somebody, a kind of group of technologists coming into our school when I was like, age 9 or something, and these like little robots, and they were letting us kind of program machine learning algorithms into these robot, really basic stuff, kind of building block stuff together. And that was when I was, aged 8 or 9 or something like that. I think there's a couple of concepts that I'd probably just want to introduce first of all. And I think the first one is the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. In a supervised learning model, you're using big data sets with labeled features of those data sets going into a training algorithm, and it's able to be like, oh, I'm learning how this data set kind of works, and I'm able to extrapolate what something might look like, given a question, I'm able to extrapolate from what I've seen previously to what other things might look like. And that's a really useful technique. Requires an awful lot of data, requires an awful lot of structured data to be present, and takes an amount of time for that learning algorithm to go and learn that, to go and be useful on additional data that's presented with. In an unsupervised world, which is the technology that Darktrace utilizes in the majority of its application. In an unsupervised world, you're looking at data points in different classifiers to spot changes in those patterns, but not given anything that you've previously seen. So in an unsupervised world, you don't need to have structured, labeled data in that sense. The classifier can be looking at certain data points. It needs a period of time to learn. It needs observable data points to say, we normally see Mike open up his laptop, log in, pull his email. That happens every single day. And then, you start to build up an idea of what internet endpoints I talk to, what internal services I use, what SaaS products I go to, the interaction I have inside those SaaS products. All of that can be brought back in, and we can start to learn a pattern for what Mike is doing. And then perhaps if we're in the same department, we can start to compare my activity to you as well. And then we get a place where we can start to do widespread comparison against other people that are doing similar type jobs. And you start to be in a position where, with an unsupervised learning approach, you can spot changes in what I do next versus what my peer group does. So two very different types of techniques that are applicable in different ways. But I think, going back to your question about being a CISO and pulling in AI into your security stack, clearly I'm biased. I work for an AI company and I believe in that. But I think it's hard, going back to my sort of defensible comments earlier, I think if you're running a defensible security program today, you need to be mixing in a whole range of different techniques. Some of those are going to be signature based, finding known threats that have been seen before. Some of them are going to be heuristics, looking for certain styles of techniques being utilized in a certain way and grouping them and alerting on that. Some of them might be, through a training algorithm, being able to extrapolate what malware might look like given what it's been presented previously. And in an unsupervised world, we're able to look at what the business does day to day, and if it's changing in abnormal, are there abnormal patterns starting to emerge, so we can find cyber attack in and amongst an organization that perhaps hasn't ever presented itself before, but it's not signatured and it's using different techniques in different orders, but we can start to find unknowns that are occurring in our business using that type of learning algorithm instead.
Now, yeah, the audience will know that we both work for Darktrace, and I think that that's okay, because when I say AI, and when you're talking about how to use this behavioral based approach, I think the approach is universal. The reason why I ended up really deciding to come to Darktrace was because in problem sets like cloud, and I think in general at the scale at which cyber attacks will continue to increase, I think about everything from the frame of automation, and I don't know exactly how we will respond to the volume of security events without something like AI. And I pose everyone in the audience, list your opinions in the comments, because I think about this all the time. And it leads me into my next question, because we're wrapping up here. I got two more for you. They're good.
Okay.
The first one, what is something that's happening that keeps you up at night?
Something that's happening that's keeping me up at night, I think you already alluded to a bit. It is the volume. I think the volume of cyber attack is increasing, and I think there's a couple of reasons. I think globally there's just more digital natives that are being that are being added. People are just growing up using technology, and some will be for good and some will be for bad. I think the state of a lot of cyber attack is linked to geopolitics and the stability of what's happening around the globe, and whether that's nation state actors being able to in a non kind of conventional way start to use cyber instead of conventional weaponry to state their case in certain areas. Cyber crime is just exploding because our money is turning digital and they're going after that. There's just more and more of it kind of entering the foray. So I think for me, that's one thing that kind of keeps me up is certainly the volume of cyber attack that we have to deal with today.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I'm not going to end it on the depressing note. We have to end it on something valuable, and something I love to ask leaders is being where you are now and taking into consideration your wealth of experience. If you're looking at you or someone like you at the beginning of their career early on, what do you think the most valuable piece of advice you would give them at this point?
I think I'd say pivot, be broad, take opportunities. There's no wrong avenue. It's all good experience. I think that, if I look at my own career, which a lot of it is by accident, I definitely, definitely kind of take that. Take opportunities as they present themselves. And certainly in the early parts of your career, I talk about being in the trenches, learning your trade, like applying a trade. Those are really valuable years for somebody who then ends up in a leadership position, either by choice or by accident, like me. but you will fondly look back to those years where you were in the trenches and you really applied a trade and understood, in detail, because you'll understand what it's like to be there, the processes that are being, that you're operating under, working with deep experts who you're trying to feed off of, perhaps. And there's a lot of experience in being in the trenches, I think, and then gaining a kind of broad perspective of experience, roll forward into 10, 20 years down the line. That's a really strong base to get into leadership.
Wow. Love it. On that note, like and subscribe, all that fun stuff. Drop a comment from Mike. We appreciate you coming on. It was very insightful. I learned a lot, and hopefully the audience learned a lot as well.
Appreciate it. Some great questions. Thank you.